Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a quieter time, a slower time. A time when dinner wasn't ordered on an app, it was mixed with your own two hands, cooked on a stovetop that ticked and hummed like it had a heartbeat, and served on plates that had been in the family longer than most of the furniture. We're talking about the 1950s, and specifically the kitchen tricks every American housewife knew by heart. The little shortcuts, the clever fixes, the wisdom passed down from mothers and grandmothers that made a home run smoothly, even when money was tight and store-bought conveniences were still years away. Before we dive in, I want to say thank you. Thank you to the person who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and your ideas always land somewhere between fascinating and oddly comforting. If you're enjoying this strange little corner of the internet where nostalgia and curiosity meet over a cup of coffee, go ahead and hit that like button, drop a comment about where you're tuning in from, and subscribe if you haven't already. And hey, the channel is now live on Spotify too, so if you want to listen while you fold laundry or drift off to sleep, the link's in the description. No pressure, just there if you want it. Now, get comfortable, really comfortable. Dim the lights, put on a fan if you've got one, let the white noise do its thing, settle in, because tonight we're going back to a time when everyone knew how to make a meal stretch, when a good housewife could turn leftovers into something that looked brand new, when cleaning solutions came from the cupboard, not the store, when there was a trick for everything: stains, burns, wilted vegetables, stuck zippers, squeaky doors, and nobody needed to Google a single one. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to run a home in 1955? What did a Tuesday morning smell like? What sounds fill the kitchen while dinner simmered? What did women actually do all day before microwaves and dishwashers? How did they keep everything so spotless with just soap and elbow grease? What did it feel like to bake bread from scratch? Not as a hobby, but because that's just what you did. Could you do it? Could you survive a week as a 1950s housewife? No takeout, no convenience foods, no quick fixes. Just you, your hands, and a kitchen full of old-fashioned know-how? Well, congratulations. It's 1955. The coffee is already percolating. Someone down the street is beating a rug on the clothesline. The milk truck just left 2 glass bottles on your doorstep, and the day is just beginning. Let's start with the morning, because nothing in a 1950s home began without coffee. Not the instant kind, not the pod kind. The real kind, ground from whole beans, measured carefully into a percolator, and left to bubble on the stove until the entire kitchen smelled like comfort and routine. You didn't just drink coffee in the 50s, you made it, you tended it, you poured it into cups that matched your best china even on a Wednesday. The percolator sat on the back burner, a silver tower with a glass dome on top where you could watch the coffee darken as it brewed. You filled the bottom chamber with cold water, fitted the metal basket with freshly ground coffee, 2 tablespoons per cup, never more, never less, and set it on medium heat. Then you waited. The waiting was part of the ritual. You didn't rush it. You couldn't rush it. After a few minutes the water began to heat, and you'd hear it. A soft gurgling, a gentle bubbling that built into a steady rhythm. The coffee began to percolate, rising through the stem and spilling over the grounds in a slow, hypnotic fountain. The glass dome filled with rich, dark liquid. The aroma spread through the kitchen, seeping into the curtains, the dish towels, the walls themselves. You stood at the counter, wiping down the same spot twice, just to have something to do while the coffee finished. You glanced at the clock. You adjusted the flame. You checked the dome again. When the coffee reached the right colour, a deep amber that caught the morning light, you turned off the heat and let it rest for a moment. Patience was everything. Then you poured. The coffee flowed into your cup, steaming and fragrant, strong enough to wake you, but smooth enough to drink black. You added cream if you liked it, spooned in sugar if you needed it, but most mornings you drank it plain. The first sip was always the same, hot, bitter, grounding. It reminded you that the day had started and you were ready. Your husband drank his coffee at the table, reading the newspaper folded into neat quarters. The kids ate their oatmeal, quiet and half awake. You stood at the counter, cup in hand, watching them, planning the day in your head. Laundry after breakfast, grocery shopping before lunch, dinner prep by 3. The coffee helped you organise it all, one sip at a time. If a neighbour stopped by, you poured another cup without asking. Coffee was currency. It meant welcome. It meant sit down, stay a while, tell me what's on your mind. You'd refill the percolator, set it back on the stove and start the whole process again. Because there was always more coffee. There was always time for one more cup. By mid-morning, the percolator had been used twice, maybe 3 times. The kitchen smelled like a cafe, warm and lived in. You rinsed the grounds down the sink, wiped the percolator clean, and set it on the counter to dry. It would be ready again by afternoon, waiting for the next pot, the next conversation, the next quiet moment when you needed something steady in your hands. The coffee ritual wasn't just about drinking coffee, it was about rhythm. It was about starting the day the right way, with something familiar and warm and entirely yours. And every morning, without fail, it worked. Sunday meant roast beef, pot roast, or chicken. Something big enough to feed the family and then some. But the magic wasn't in Sunday's dinner, it was in what came after. A good housewife knew how to make that roast last all week long. Monday brought cold sandwiches. Tuesday turned the bones into soup. Wednesday saw the scraps folded into casserole. By Friday, you'd have stretched one chicken into 5 completely different meals, and nobody felt cheated. The roast itself was a production. You seasoned it the night before, rubbing salt, pepper and herbs into the meat, until your fingers smelled like thyme and garlic. Sunday morning, you placed it in the oven, surrounded by potatoes, carrots and onions. The house filled with the smell of slow roasting meat, a scent so rich it made your mouth water hours before the meal was ready. Dinner was served at noon, right after church. The family gathered around the table, and you sliced the roast carefully, making sure everyone got a good piece. There was gravy made from the drippings, vegetables soft and caramelized, and bread to soak up every last bit of flavour. It was the best meal of the week, and everyone knew it. But the real work began Monday morning. You pulled the leftover meat from the icebox, still cold and firm, and sliced it thin for sandwiches. White bread, a smear of butter, maybe a leaf of lettuce if you had it. The kids took them to school wrapped in wax paper. Your husband took one to work in a tin lunch pail. Simple, satisfying, gone by noon. Tuesday, you took the bones, the ones everyone had picked clean the day before, and dropped them into a pot of water with celery, onions and a bay leaf. You let it simmer all morning, low and slow, until the kitchen smelled like broth, and the bones had given up every bit of flavour they had left. By lunchtime, you had soup. You added noodles, or rice, or whatever vegetables were starting to wilt in the icebox. It tasted like Sunday, but lighter, warmer, stretched just a little further. Wednesday was casserole day. You shredded the last bits of meat, mixed them with cream of mushroom soup, peas and breadcrumbs, and baked it all together until the top turned golden and crispy. It didn't look like Sunday's roast anymore. It looked like something new, but when you took that first bite you could still taste the original meal buried underneath the layers. Thursday, if there was anything left, you made hash. You diced the meat into tiny pieces, fried it with onions and potatoes, and served it with a fried egg on top. The crispy edges, the runny yolk, the way everything came together in the pan, it was humble, but it was good. It was the kind of meal that filled you up and reminded you that nothing in your kitchen went to waste. By Friday the roast was gone, completely gone. but you'd fed your family 5 dinners, 5 lunches, and a few snacks in between, all from one piece of meat. It wasn't about being cheap, it was about being smart. It was about knowing how to stretch what you had, how to honour the food, how to make sure nothing was wasted, and next Sunday you'd start all over again. Your refrigerator wasn't a refrigerator, it was an ice box, a sturdy metal cabinet cooled by an actual block of ice delivered twice a week by the Iceman. You learned to arrange things carefully, the coldest items closest to the ice, the butter and eggs on the warmer shelf. You learned to work fast when the door was open, because every second of warm air meant the ice melted faster, and you learned to save the meltwater, because nothing in a 1950s kitchen went to waste. The Iceman came on Tuesdays and Fridays. You'd hear the truck rumbling down the street and you'd step outside to meet him. He wore a leather apron and thick gloves, and he carried the ice with metal tongs, hoisting it onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. You told him what size you needed, 25 pounds, 50 pounds, 75 if it was summer, and he chipped it down to fit. Inside, you opened the top compartment of the icebox and slid the old block out into the drip pan below. If it was still mostly solid, you'd chip pieces off it for lemonade or iced tea. If it had melted down to a sliver, you poured the water into a pitcher and set it aside for later. Then you lifted the new block into place, wiped the compartment dry and closed the door. The icebox changed the way you thought about food. Everything had to be planned. Milk went on the top shelf right next to the ice. Butter went on the second shelf where it stayed soft enough to spread but cold enough not to spoil. Eggs went in a bowl on the third shelf along with leftover meat wrapped in wax paper. Vegetables went in the crisper drawer at the bottom, where the air was coolest but not freezing. You opened the door as little as possible. Every time you reached in, you moved quickly, grabbed what you need, closed the door, don't linger. If you left it open too long, the ice melted faster, and you'd have to call the Iceman for an extra delivery. That cost money. So you learned to be efficient. You learned to know exactly where everything was without looking. The meltwater collected in a tray beneath the icebox and you emptied it twice a day. Most people poured it down the sink, but not you. You saved it in a pitcher and used it to water the plants, or to rinse vegetables, or to fill the dog's bowl. It was clean, it was cold, it was free. And in a 1950s kitchen, you used every resource you had. On hot summer days, the ice melted faster. You'd open the icebox in the morning and find the block half its original size by noon. The milk stayed cold, but barely. The butter softened too much. The lettuce wilted at the edges. You learned to shop more often in summer, buying only what you could use before it spoiled. In winter, the opposite problem appeared. The kitchen was so cold that the icebox barely needed ice at all. You'd leave the butter on the counter, where it stayed firm without refrigeration. You'd store leftovers in a covered dish on the back porch where the cold air kept them fresh. The icebox sat mostly empty, a metal monument to a problem that solved itself. But year-round, the icebox was the heart of the kitchen. It dictated your schedule, your shopping, your meals. It required attention, care, and respect. And in return, it kept your food cold, your family fed, and your home running smoothly. Next to the stove, in every kitchen, sat a small tin can. It wasn't trash, it was treasure. Every time you fried bacon, you poured the leftover grease into that can, and then you used it for frying eggs, greasing pans, adding flavour to vegetables, even waterproofing boots. Bacon grease was the secret ingredient nobody talked about because everybody already knew. It was just what you did. The can itself was usually a coffee tin or an old soup can, something sturdy with a wide mouth. You kept it on the stovetop within arm's reach, because bacon grease was used constantly. It sat there, day after day, slowly filling up with layers of golden fat, each one adding to the flavour of whatever came next. Frying bacon was a weekend ritual. You laid the strips in a cold skillet, turned the heat to medium, and let them sizzle slowly until they curled and crisped. The smell filled the house, rich and smoky, pulling everyone toward the kitchen like a magnet. When the bacon was done, you lifted it out with a fork, set it on a plate lined with newspaper to drain, and then, this was the important part, you poured the grease into the can. You tilted the pan carefully, letting the hot fat stream into the tin. It hissed faintly as it hit the cooler grease below, settling into a smooth amber pool. You wiped the pan clean with a rag, set it back on the stove and put the lid on the grease can. Done. Ready for the next meal. That grease became the foundation of everything you cooked. Scrambled eggs on Monday morning, a spoonful of bacon grease in the pan, green beans at dinner, another spoonful, melted until it coated the beans and made them taste like Sunday. Cornbread that needed a crispy crust. Grease in the skillet, heated until it smoked, then the batter poured on top. The grease didn't just cook the food, it flavoured it. It made everything taste a little bit better, a little bit richer, a little bit more like home. You also used it for things that had nothing to do with cooking. A squeaky door hinge, dab a little bacon grease on it with your finger and it stopped squeaking. Boots that needed waterproofing, rub the grease into the leather, let it soak in overnight, and they'd last another season. A cast iron skillet that needed seasoning, bacon grease, rubbed in thin and baked until it formed a slick black coating that nothing would stick to. The can itself became a little bit magical over time. The top layer stayed liquid when the stove was warm, but the bottom layer solidified into pale, creamy fat that you could scoop out with a spoon. It smelled faintly of smoke and salt, a reminder of every breakfast that had come before. When the can got full, you scooped some out into the trash, or you gave it to a neighbour who kept chickens. But you never let it run empty. There was always grease in the can, always ready, always waiting. Some people thought it was old-fashioned. Some people thought it was unsanitary, but you knew better. Bacon grease wasn't dirty. It was fat, pure and simple, and it had been used in kitchens for generations. Your mother used it. Her mother used it. And now you used it standing at the stove, pouring the grease into the can just like they did, keeping the tradition alive one strip of bacon at a time. It was resourcefulness. It was frugality. It was respect for the food, for the work, for the life you were building in that kitchen. And every time you opened that can and scooped out a spoonful, you were connected to every woman who had ever done the same. If you wanted butter, you made it. You bought cream from the milkman, poured it into a jar, and shook it until your arms ached and the cream turned thick and solid. Sometimes the kids helped, passing the jar back and forth like a game. Sometimes you did it alone, standing at the counter, shaking and humming along to the radio. Either way, by the time you were done, you had fresh butter, soft, yellow, and still faintly warm from your hands. The cream arrived in glass bottles, thick and heavy, with a layer of yellow cream floating on top of the milk. You poured the cream into a wide-mouthed mason jar, leaving a little room at the top for the butter to move as it formed. Then you screwed the lid on tight, wiped the outside dry, and started shaking. At first, the cream sloshed around inside the jar, liquid and loose. You shook it hard up and down, side to side, listening to it splash against the glass. After a few minutes, your arms started to burn. You switched hands, you took a break, you shook some more. The kids loved this part. They'd take turns holding the jar, giggling every time the cream sloshed, racing to see who could shake it the longest. You'd set a timer, make it a game, tell them they were helping make magic, and in a way, they were. Because turning cream into butter felt like alchemy, something liquid becoming something solid right there in your hands. After 10 minutes, maybe 15, the cream began to change. It thickened. It stopped sloshing and started clumping, sticking to the sides of the jar. You shook harder, faster, determined to finish, and then suddenly it happened. The fat separated from the liquid. The buttermilk drained to the bottom of the jar, thin and pale, while the butter formed into a soft golden lump floating on top. You unscrewed the lid and poured off the buttermilk, saving it in a separate jar for biscuits or pancakes later. Then you scooped the butter out with a wooden spoon and pressed it into a bowl. It was soft, almost fluffy, still warm from all the motion. You rinsed it under cold water, kneading it gently with your hands to squeeze out the last drops of buttermilk. If you left any liquid behind, the butter would spoil faster, so you worked it carefully, patiently, until the water ran clear. Then came the fun part. You could leave it plain, or you could mix in a pinch of salt, or a spoonful of honey, or fresh herbs from the garden. You pressed it into a small crock, smoothed the top with the back of a spoon, and set it in the icebox to firm up. By dinner time, it was ready, spreadable, flavourful, made entirely by hand. Fresh butter tasted different from store-bought. It was richer, creamier, with a faint sweetness that lingered on your tongue. You spread it on warm bread and watched it melt into the crust. You dolloped it onto mashed potatoes and stirred until it disappeared. You used it in cookies, in cakes, in everything that needed fat and flavour. And every time you made it, you felt a little bit proud. Because making butter wasn't hard, but it took effort. It took time. It took the willingness to stand at the counter and shake a jar until your shoulders ached. And when you finally sat down at the table and tasted that butter on your bread, you knew it was worth it. Bread wasn't something you picked up at the store. It was something you started in the morning and finished by noon. You mixed flour, water, yeast and salt in a big ceramic bowl, kneaded it until your wrists were sore, and set it on the windowsill to rise in the sun. The kitchen smelled like yeast and warmth, and when the dough had doubled in size, you punched it down, shaped it into loaves, and baked it until the crust turned golden and the house smelled like home. Bread making began the night before with the sponge. You dissolved a cake of yeast in warm water, stirred in a little sugar to feed it, and let it sit until it bubbled and foamed. Then you added flour, just enough to make a thick batter, and covered the bowl with a damp towel. By morning the sponge had risen and collapsed, filling the kitchen with the sharp, tangy smell of fermentation. You added more flour, a handful at a time, stirring with a wooden spoon until the dough became too thick to stir. Then you turned it out onto the counter and started kneading. You pressed the dough away from you with the heels of your hands, folded it back over itself, turned it a quarter turn and pressed again, over and over. The dough was sticky at first, clinging to your fingers, but you kept kneading, adding small dustings of flour until it became smooth and elastic. Kneading took 10 minutes, sometimes 15. Your wrists ached, your shoulders burned, but you didn't stop. You could feel the dough changing under your hands, transforming from a shaggy mess into something alive, something that pushed back when you pressed it. When it was ready, you shaped it into a ball, placed it back in the bowl, and covered it with the towel again. Then came the rising. You set the bowl on the windowsill, where the morning sun streamed in warm and bright. The dough sat there, soaking up the heat, slowly expanding as the yeast worked its magic. You checked it every half hour, peeking under the towel, watching it grow. When it had doubled in size, soft and puffy, pressing gently against the sides of the bowl, you knew it was ready. You punched it down, your fists sinking into the dough with a soft whoosh of air. It deflated immediately, collapsing back into itself. You turned it out onto the counter, divided it into 2 pieces and shaped each one into a loaf. You tucked the edges under, smoothed the tops, and placed them into greased loaf pans. Then you covered them again and set them back on the windowsill for the second rise. The second rise was faster. The dough puffed up again, filling the pans, cresting just above the rim. You preheated the oven, slid the loaves inside, and set the timer. The kitchen filled with the smell of baking bread, yeasty, toasty, impossibly comforting. You stood at the oven door, watching through the window as the loaves browned and the crusts crackled. When the timer rang, you pulled the loaves out and tapped the bottoms with your knuckles. They sounded hollow, a deep resonant thump that meant they were done. You turned them out of the pans and set them on a wire rack to cool, though you always sliced into one while it was still warm. The crust crackled under the knife. The steam rose in soft clouds. You buttered a slice, took a bite, and felt the satisfaction of knowing you'd made this with your own 2 hands. Eggs were cheap in summer and expensive in winter, so a smart housewife bought extra. When they were plentiful and preserved them in water glass, a thick, clear solution made from sodium silicate. You placed the eggs gently into a crock, poured the water glass over them, and sealed the container. Months later, when eggs were scarce, you'd pull one out, rinse it off, and crack it open like it had been laid yesterday. It wasn't magic, it was chemistry, and every housewife knew it. The process started in late spring, when the hens were laying more eggs than your family could eat. You bought them by the dozen from a neighbour or a farmer at the market, checking each one carefully to make sure the shells were clean and uncracked. Cracked eggs wouldn't keep. Dirty eggs wouldn't keep. Only perfect eggs went into the water glass. You mixed the solution in a large crock, the kind used for pickling or fermenting. 1 part sodium silicate to 9 parts boiled water, cooled to room temperature. The liquid was thick and slippery, almost like glycerin, and it smelled faintly chemical. You stirred it until it was smooth, then began adding the eggs. You lowered each egg into the crock gently, one at a time, making sure it didn't crack against the others. The water glass covered them completely, sealing the porous shells and preventing air from getting inside. Air was the enemy. Air meant bacteria, and bacteria meant spoilage. But the water glass kept everything out, preserving the eggs in a kind of suspended animation. Layer by layer, you filled the crock. A dozen eggs, then another dozen, then another until the crock was full and heavy. You covered it with a lid or a piece of cloth tied tight, and you stored it in the coolest part of the house, the basement, the pantry, the back porch. And then you waited. Summer turned to fall. Fall turned to winter. The hens stopped laying as the days grew shorter and colder. Eggs at the market became scarce, and when you could find them, they cost twice as much as they had in May. But you didn't need to buy them. You had your crock. You went down to the basement, lifted the lid, and reached into the water glass. The liquid was cold and slick against your fingers. You pulled out an egg, rinsed it under the pump, and dried it on your apron. It looked exactly the same as it had 6 months ago. You cracked it into a bowl, watching the yolk settle bright and firm, surrounded by clear white. It smelled fine. It looked fine. And when you scrambled it for breakfast, it tasted just like a fresh egg. The water glass method wasn't perfect. Eggs stored this way didn't whip as well for meringues or angel food cake. The whites were a little thinner, a little less cooperative, but for scrambled eggs, fried eggs, baking, and custards, they worked beautifully. And when eggs were expensive or unavailable, having a crock full of preserved eggs felt like having money in the bank. You used them sparingly through the winter, pulling one out when you needed it, always careful to keep the others submerged. By early spring, when the hens started laying again, the crock would be nearly empty. You'd pour out the leftover water glass, scrub the crock clean, and start the process all over again. It was one more way to make sure your family never went without. One more way to take what was abundant and save it for when it wasn't. And one more reminder that in a 1950s kitchen, planning ahead wasn't optional. It was survival. Dishes were washed by hand. Always. You filled the sink with hot water and soap flakes, scrubbed each plate and glass until it squeaked, and rinsed everything in a second sink of clean water. Then you stacked them in the drying rack and let the air do the rest. It took time. It took patience. But it also gave you a rhythm. A quiet, repetitive task that let your mind wander, while your hands stayed busy. The routine never changed. After dinner you cleared the table, scraping the plates into the compost bucket or the dog's bowl. You stack the dishes beside the sink in order, glasses first, then plates, then silverware, then pots and pans. The dirtiest items went on the bottom, the cleanest went on top. It was a system, and systems made the work go faster. You filled the left side of the sink with hot water, as hot as you could stand, and added soap flakes. A handful, maybe two, depending on how greasy the dishes were. The flakes dissolved slowly, releasing tiny bubbles that floated on the surface. You swished your hand through the water, mixing it until it was sudsy and slick. Then you started washing. Glasses first, because they were the cleanest. You dipped each one into the soapy water, scrubbed the inside with a dishcloth, and ran your finger around the rim to make sure there were no lipstick marks. Then you rinsed it in the second sink, the one filled with clear water, and set it upside down in the drying rack. Plates came next. You scrubbed each one in circles, starting at the centre and working your way out to the edges. If something was stuck, a bit of gravy, a smear of mashed potatoes, you scraped it off with your fingernail or a brush. Then you rinsed it, inspected it, and added it to the rack. Silverware went into the soapy water all at once. You swished them around, scrubbed each fork and spoon individually, and rinsed them in a bundle under the tap. They went into a cup in the drying rack, handles down, tips up so the water drained properly. Pots and pans came last because they were the hardest. If something was burned onto the bottom, you filled it with water and a little baking soda and let it soak while you washed everything else. Then you scrubbed it with steel wool, working at the burn spots until they came free. Your hands smelled like metal and soap. Your fingers pruned from the hot water. But you kept going, because the dishes had to be done. When everything was washed and rinsed, you drained the sink and wiped it down with a rag. Then you wrung out the dishcloth, draped it over the faucet to dry, and stepped back. The dishes sat in the rack, dripping slowly, drying in the open air. By morning they'd be completely dry, ready to put away. The washing itself was work, but it was also strangely peaceful. The warm water, the repetitive motion, the sound of plates clinking together. It gave you time to think, to process the day, to let your mind drift while your hands stayed busy. Some nights you thought about nothing at all. Other nights you replayed conversations, planned tomorrow's meals, worried about money or the kids or your husband's job. The dishes didn't care. They just sat there, waiting to be cleaned, one after another, until the work was done. And when the last dish was rinsed and the sink was empty, you dried your hands on your apron and turned off the kitchen light. The dishes were done. The kitchen was clean. And tomorrow you'd do it all over again. If a pan caught fire on the stove, you didn't panic. You didn't reach for water. You reached for baking soda or a lid and smothered the flames calmly, like you'd done it 100 times before. Because fire was a fact of life in a 1950s kitchen, and every housewife knew how to handle it without burning the house down. It was just part of the job. Grease fires happened. They happened when you weren't paying attention, when the heat was too high, when you turned your back for just a second. One moment you were frying chicken. The next moment the oil had ignited, flames leaping from the pan in bright orange bursts. The air smelled like burning fat and danger, and you had about 3 seconds to make the right decision. Water was the wrong decision. Water would make it worse. Water would cause the burning oil to splatter and spread, turning one small fire into a kitchen full of flames. Every housewife knew this, not because someone had told them, but because they'd seen it happen, or heard about it happening to someone else. Water and grease didn't mix. Ever. So you reached for the baking soda. The box sat on the counter, always within reach, ready for moments like this. You grabbed it, twisted off the top and dumped it onto the flames. The fire hissed and sputtered, smothered under the white powder. The flames died almost instantly, leaving behind a pan full of smoking oil and a kitchen full of relief. If you didn't have baking soda, you used a lid. You grabbed the lid that fit the pan, held it in front of you like a shield, and dropped it over the flames. The fire died immediately, starved of oxygen, replaced by a dull glow and a thin trail of smoke. You turned off the burner, stepped back, and waited for everything to cool. The danger was over. The trick was staying calm. Panicking made everything worse. Screaming made everything worse. Running made everything worse. You had to move quickly but deliberately, reaching for the right tool, making the right choice, trusting yourself to fix the problem before it got out of hand. And you did, because you had to. After the fire was out, you dealt with the mess. You carried the pan outside and left it on the back step to cool. You opened the windows to let the smoke out. You wiped down the stove, the counter, the walls, anywhere the smoke had left a greasy film. The kitchen smelled like burned oil for hours, sometimes days, but it was better than the alternative. You also learned from it. You learned not to leave hot oil unattended. You learned to keep the heat lower, to watch more closely, to stay in the kitchen when something was frying. You learned where the baking soda was kept, where the lids were stacked, which tools you could grab in an emergency without thinking. And you passed that knowledge along to your daughters, teaching them the same way you'd been taught, by example, by repetition, by making sure they knew what to do if the worst happened. Because fire in the kitchen wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. And when it happened, you handled it, you smothered it, you cleaned it up, you moved on. That's what a housewife did. That's what a housewife had always done. Your silverware wasn't kept in a drawer gathering dust. It was polished, regularly. You squeezed a dab of toothpaste onto a soft cloth, rubbed each fork and spoon until the tarnish disappeared, and rinsed them under warm water. Then you dried them carefully and put them back in the felt-lined box where they belonged. Because even on a regular Tuesday, your table deserved to look like Sunday. The silverware had been a wedding gift, a set of 12 place settings packed in a wooden box with velvet compartments. It wasn't something you used every day. It was too nice for that, too precious. You brought it out for holidays, for company, for dinners, when you wanted the table to look its best. And the rest of the time, it sat in the box, tucked away in the sideboard, slowly tarnishing in the dark. Tarnish was inevitable. Silver reacted with sulphur in the air, turning dull and grey, losing its shine. If you left it too long, the tarnish would darken to black, creeping into the crevices of the patterns, settling into the spaces between the fork tines. But you didn't let it get that bad. You polished it regularly every few months, keeping it bright and ready. You spread a towel on the kitchen table and laid out the silverware piece by piece. Forks, knives, spoons, serving pieces, everything that needed attention. You filled a bowl with warm water and set it nearby. Then you unscrewed the cap on the toothpaste and squeezed a small amount onto a clean rag. You started with a fork, rubbing the toothpaste onto the tarnished areas in small circles. The paste was gritty, mildly abrasive, perfect for cutting through the dull grey film. You worked it into the pattern, scrubbing gently, watching the tarnish lift and the silver brighten underneath. It didn't take much pressure, just patience, just time. When the fork was clean, you rinsed it under warm water, rubbing it with your fingers to remove any leftover paste. Then you dried it with a soft towel, buffing it until it gleamed. You held it up to the light, checking for spots you might have missed. Satisfied, you set it aside and reached for the next piece. One by one, you polished the entire set. Your hands smelled like mint and metal. Your fingers cramped from gripping the cloth. But the work was satisfying in a way that was hard to explain. Each piece you finished felt like a small victory, a tiny act of care that would make the next special dinner just a little bit nicer. When everything was clean, you dried each piece one more time, making sure no water spots remained. Then you placed them back in the box, each fork in its slot, each spoon nested beside its match. The velvet held them gently, protecting them from scratches, keeping them safe until the next time they were needed. You closed the box and returned it to the sideboard. The silverware was ready. The table was ready. And when company came, when the good dishes were brought out and the napkins were folded just so, your silverware would shine like new, a quiet testament to the care you took, the standards you kept, the home you built one polished spoon at a time. If your lettuce had gone limp, you didn't throw it away. You filled a bowl with ice water, submerged the leaves, and waited. 10 minutes later, the lettuce was crisp again, firm and fresh like you'd just picked it from the garden. It was such a simple trick that it almost felt like cheating, but it worked every time. The lettuce usually wilted by Thursday or Friday, a few days after you'd bought it to the market. You'd pull it from the icebox and find the leaves soft and droopy, folded over on themselves like they'd given up. In a modern kitchen, that lettuce would go straight into the trash. But in a 1950s kitchen, nothing got thrown away that easily, not if it could be saved. You filled a large mixing bowl with cold water and added ice, cubes from the ice tray or chips from the block in the icebox. The water turned icy and sharp, cold enough to make your fingers ache if you left them in too long. Then you separated the lettuce leaves one by one and dropped them into the bowl. They floated on the surface, limp and lifeless, like something that had been defeated. And then you waited. You didn't rush it. You set the bowl on the counter and turned your attention to something else, peeling potatoes, slicing tomatoes, checking on the roast in the oven. Every few minutes you glanced at the bowl, watching the leaves shift slightly in the water, but mostly you just let them be. After 10 minutes, something remarkable happened. The leaves began to firm up, the edges uncurled, the stems straightened. You reached into the icy water and lifted a leaf out, shaking off the excess water. It was crisp. Not just slightly improved, but genuinely crisp, snapping cleanly when you bent it, feeling fresh and alive in your hand. You pulled the rest of the leaves from the bowl, shook them dry and laid them on a clean dish towel. You patted them gently, blotting away the water, careful not to bruise them. Then you stacked them neatly, wrapped them in the towel, and tucked them back into the icebox. By dinner time, they'd be ready, cool, crisp, perfect for salad. The trick worked for more than just lettuce. Celery that had gone rubbery could be revived the same way. Radishes that had lost their snap. Even herbs that had started to wilt. Anything that had been alive and growing responded to the cold water, drinking it in, plumping back up, returning to something close to its original state. It wasn't a miracle, it was science. The cold water moved into the plant cells through osmosis, filling them back up, restoring the pressure that made the leaves firm. But knowing the science didn't make it feel any less like magic. Watching something limp and sad become crisp and useful again never got old. You used this trick constantly, almost every week. Because lettuce was expensive and wasting it felt wrong. Because you'd learned from your mother, who'd learned from hers, that food was precious and deserved a second chance. Because in a 1950s kitchen, resourcefulness wasn't just a virtue, it was a necessity. And so, week after week, you filled the bowl with ice water, dropped in the wilted leaves, and waited. 10 minutes later, you had fresh lettuce again. Simple, effective, free. The kind of small kitchen magic that made everything else possible. Leftovers didn't go into plastic containers because plastic containers didn't exist yet. They went into glass bowls covered with wax paper and rubber bands, or wrapped tightly in aluminum foil, or tucked into empty butter dishes. Everything had a second life. And if something didn't fit, you found a way to make it fit because wasting food wasn't an option. The system was improvised, pieced together from whatever you had on hand. Glass mixing bowls became storage containers. Empty coffee cans held soup. Mason jars kept gravy fresh. Pie plates were covered with dinner plates turned upside down. Nothing matched. Nothing was designed for this purpose, but everything worked. Wax paper was your best friend. You tore off a square, pressed it over the top of a bowl, and secured it with a rubber band stretched tight. The paper formed a seal, not airtight, but good enough to keep the food fresh for a day or two. You could see through it, sort of, if you held it up to the light, and when you were done with it, you could wipe it clean and reuse it, folding it neatly and tucking it back into the drawer. Aluminum foil was newer, fancier, and more expensive. You used it sparingly, mostly for things that needed a tighter seal, leftover roast, half an onion, a slice of pie. You pressed the foil around the food, crimping the edges, making sure no air got in. And when you unwrapped it, you smoothed it out flat, folded it, and saved it for next time. Foil could be reused 3 or 4 times before it tore too much to be useful. The icebox became a puzzle. You stacked bowls on top of bowls, tucked small containers into empty spaces, balanced plates on top of jars. Every inch of space mattered. You arranged things by size, by what needed to be eaten first, by what would spoil fastest. Milk and meat went on the top shelf closest to the ice. Vegetables went in the crisper. Leftovers filled the middle shelves. Each one covered and labelled in your mind because you didn't write anything down. You just remembered. You also knew exactly what was in there at any given moment. The chicken from Sunday, the green beans from Tuesday, the mashed potatoes from last night. You planned meals around what needed to be used, eating your way through the leftovers before they spoiled. Nothing sat in the icebox for more than a few days. Nothing got forgotten in the back. You couldn't afford to lose track. Some things didn't even go in the icebox. Bread stayed in the bread box on the counter. Potatoes and onions lived in a basket in the pantry. Apples sat in a bowl on the table. You stored food wherever it made sense, wherever it would last the longest, wherever it was easiest to reach when you needed it. And when something did spoil, when the milk turned sour, when the lettuce finally gave up, when the bread grew mould, you didn't throw the container away. You washed it, dried it, and put it back into rotation. Because the container was just as valuable as the food. More valuable, maybe, because it would last for years. The system wasn't elegant. It wasn't efficient by modern standards. But it worked. It kept your food fresh, your family fed, and your kitchen organised. And every time you opened the icebox and saw those mismatched bowls and jars stacked neatly inside, you felt a small sense of pride. Because you'd figured it out. You'd made do. You'd found a way to make everything fit. You didn't buy cleaning products, you made them. Vinegar and newspaper for the windows, baking soda for the sink, lemon juice for cutting boards, boiling water and soap flakes for the floors. Every surface in your home could be cleaned with something you already had in the pantry, and it worked just as well as anything you could buy, maybe better. The vinegar lived under the sink in a glass jug, always ready. You diluted it with water, half and half, and poured it into an empty jar. Then you crumpled up yesterday's newspaper, dipped it into the vinegar solution, and scrubbed the windows in wide circles. The paper didn't leave streaks, it didn't shed lint. It just cleaned, leaving the glass clear and bright, and when you were done, you tossed the newspaper into the stove to burn. Nothing wasted. Baking soda cleaned almost everything else. You sprinkled it into the sink, scrubbed it with a damp rag, and watched it lift stains you thought were permanent. You mixed it with a little water to form a paste and used it to scrub the stovetop, the counters, the inside of the oven. It was gritty enough to cut through grease, but gentle enough not to scratch. And it left everything smelling clean and neutral, not perfumed, not chemical, just clean. For cutting boards, you used lemon. You cut a lemon in half, sprinkled the cut side with coarse salt, and scrubbed the board in long strokes. The acid cut through the grease and fat, the salt acted as an abrasive, and the lemon left behind a fresh, bright smell. You rinsed the board with hot water, dried it with a towel, and leaned it against the wall to air out. By morning, it was ready to use again. The floors got mopped with hot water and soap flakes. You heated a kettle until the water was almost boiling, poured it into a bucket and added a handful of soap. The flakes dissolved slowly, turning the water cloudy and slick. You dipped the mop in, wrung it out until it was just damp, and pushed it across the floor in steady strokes. The hot water loosened the dirt, the soap lifted it away, and when you were done, the floor was clean and the whole kitchen smelled like soap and steam. You also used soap flakes for laundry, for dishes, for scrubbing the bathtub. They came in a cardboard box with a pouring spout, light and fluffy, dissolving easily in water. They weren't harsh. They didn't have perfume or dyes or chemicals you couldn't pronounce. They were just soap, pure and simple, and they cleaned everything. For tough jobs, burned pots, stubborn, stains, greasy ovens, you used a combination. Baking soda and vinegar together created a fizzy paste that ate through grime. Lemon and salt worked on rust. Boiling water and soap flakes loosened anything stuck to the floor. You didn't need a different product for every surface. You just needed to know how to use what you had. The cleaning itself took time, but it was satisfying. You scrubbed and rinsed and dried, watching surfaces go from dull to bright, from sticky to smooth. And when you were done, you stood back and looked at your clean kitchen, your clean floors, your sparkling windows, and felt the quiet pride of knowing you'd done it yourself. With your own two hands, with things you'd made, with nothing wasted and nothing bought. Jello wasn't dessert. It was a side dish, a main course, a centerpiece. You mixed it with vegetables, canned fruit, cottage cheese or tuna, poured it into a mould, and let it set in the icebox until it jiggled like a jewel. Then you sliced it, served it on lettuce, and called it salad. It sounds strange now, but back then it was elegant, sophisticated, modern. Jello came in small boxes, each one a different flavour: lime, lemon, orange, cherry, strawberry. You dissolved the powder in boiling water, stirred until the crystals disappeared, and added cold water to cool it down. Then came the fun part. You added whatever you wanted. Shredded carrots and pineapple for a sweet version, celery and olives for a savoury one, cottage cheese for creaminess, canned fruit cocktail for colour. You poured the mixture into a mould, a ring mould, a bundt pan, a simple glass dish, and carefully placed it in the icebox. Then you waited. It took hours for the jello to set, hours of checking on it, jiggling the pan gently to see if it was firm yet. When it was finally ready, you ran warm water over the outside of the mould, placed a plate on top and flipped it over. The jello released with a soft sucking sound, sliding out in one perfect glossy piece. The finished salad sat on the plate, gleaming and translucent, with bits of vegetables or fruit suspended inside like artifacts in amber. It looked impressive. It looked like something a professional chef might make. And when you brought it to the table, your family and guests always oohed and ahed, even if they weren't entirely sure what was in it. Taste-wise, jello salads were an acquired experience. The sweetness of the gelatin clashed with the savoury vegetables. The texture was slippery and strange. But that wasn't the point. The point was that it looked modern. It looked like progress. It looked like the 1950s, bright, optimistic, a little bit weird, and absolutely confident that this was the future. You served it on a bed of iceberg lettuce, sometimes with a dollop of mayonnaise on top. You cut it into neat slices, each one wobbling slightly as it hit the plate. And everyone ate it, because it was there, because it was expected. because this was what a proper dinner looked like in 1955. Some families had favourite combinations: lime jello with shredded cabbage and crushed pineapple, orange jello with grated carrots and raisins, lemon jello with tuna and celery. Every recipe was passed around at church socials and bridge clubs, each one slightly different, each one claimed to be the best. You also made jello salads for special occasions, holidays, potlucks, dinner parties. You brought them in your best serving dish, the one with the scalloped edges, and you set them on the buffet table alongside the casseroles and the deviled eggs. And when people asked for the recipe, you recited it from memory because you'd made it so many times you didn't need to write it down. Looking back, it's easy to laugh at jello salads, to see them as a strange artifact of a bygone era. But in the moment, they were serious. They were elegant. They were a way to show that you were modern, that you were keeping up with the times, that you could turn a box of powder and some canned vegetables into something beautiful. And in a 1950s kitchen, that was no small thing. When a sock developed a hole, you didn't throw it away. You darned it. You slipped a wooden egg inside the sock to stretch the fabric taut, threaded a needle with matching yarn, and wove it back and forth across the hole until it disappeared. You did this in the evening, sitting by the radio, half listening to a program while your hands worked automatically. It was slow, meditative, necessary. The wooden darning egg lived in your sewing basket, smooth and worn from years of use. It fit perfectly in the palm of your hand, the right size to stretch a sock heel or toe without distorting the fabric. You slipped it into the sock, positioned it under the hole and held it up to the light. The thin spots glowed translucent. The worn threads looked fragile, ready to give way completely. You threaded a needle with yarn that matched the sock as closely as possible. Navy for navy, grey for grey, black for black. If you didn't have an exact match, you used something close, knowing that the darn would show a little, but that it was better than a hole. You tied a small knot at the end of the thread and got to work. The first step was to outline the damaged area, stitching around the hole in a rough square or circle. This stabilized the fabric, kept the hole from getting bigger while you worked. Then you began the actual darning, weaving the needle back and forth across the hole, creating a grid of parallel threads. Each pass of the needle was careful, deliberate, laying down a foundation that would hold. Once the vertical threads were in place, you wove the horizontal ones through them, over and under, like a tiny loom. The yarn interlaced, forming a patch that was dense and strong, almost like new fabric. Your stitches had to be even, not too tight or the fabric would pucker, not too loose or the patch would sag. It took concentration. It took patience. But your hands knew what to do. You'd darned hundreds of socks over the years, your husband's work socks, the kids' school socks, your own everyday socks. Your fingers moved automatically, pulling the thread, weaving it through, checking the tension. You didn't have to think about it. Your mind was free to wander. The radio played in the background. A mystery program, or a comedy show, or the evening news. You listened with half your attention, following the story loosely, laughing at the jokes, shaking your head at the headlines. The radio kept you company. It filled the silence. It made the work feel less like work and more like a quiet evening at home. When the darn was finished, you snipped the thread, tied it off, and pulled the sock off the darning egg. You held it up to the light again, inspecting your work. The patch was visible, a slightly thicker spot on the heel or toe, but it was solid. It would hold. The sock would last another few months, maybe longer, before it needed darning again. You folded it neatly and added it to the pile of finished socks. Then you reached for the next one, slipped the darning egg inside and started again. One sock after another, hole after hole, until the basket was empty and your hands were tired and the radio program had moved on to the next show. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't fun, but it was satisfying in its own quiet way. Every sock you darned was money saved, waste avoided, resources stretched just a little bit further. And in a 1950s household, that mattered. Even though the war was over, many families still kept a victory garden. Tomatoes, green beans, carrots, lettuce, anything that would grow in your backyard. You planted in spring, weeded all summer, and harvested in fall. And when the vegetables came in faster than you could eat them, you canned them, pickled them, or gave them to the neighbours, because fresh food was worth the effort. The garden plot sat at the back of the yard past the clothesline and the swing set. It wasn't large, maybe 20 feet by 30, but it was enough. You'd tilled the soil in early April, turning it over with a spade, breaking up the clumps, pulling out the weeds and rocks. The dirt was dark and rich, still cool from winter, smelling like earth and possibility. You planted in rows, each one marked with a wooden stake and a label written in pencil. Tomatoes along the back where they could climb stakes without shading the other plants. Green beans in the middle because they grew fast and didn't need much attention. Carrots and radishes toward the front where you could pull them easily. Lettuce along the edge where it would get some shade from the beans. Planting was careful work. You dug shallow trenches with your fingers, dropped in the seeds one by one, and covered them with soil. Then you watered everything gently, using the watering can, trying not to wash the seeds away, and then you waited. For days, sometimes a week, watching the bare dirt for any sign of life. When the seedlings finally pushed through, tiny and green and fragile, you felt a small surge of pride. They'd made it. They were growing. You weeded around them carefully, pulling out the intruders without disturbing the vegetables. You watered them every evening, soaking the soil deep so the roots would grow strong. By midsummer, the garden was thriving. The tomatoes climbed their stakes, heavy with green fruit that would ripen slowly in the sun. The beans hung in thick clusters, ready to pick every few days. The carrots sent up feathery green tops. The lettuce spread into full leafy heads. You picked what you needed for dinner, carrying it inside in your apron, still warm from the sun. But the real harvest came in late summer and early fall. Suddenly everything ripened at once. More tomatoes than you could eat, more beans than you could cook. You spent your afternoons picking, sorting, washing. Your kitchen counter was covered with vegetables. Your icebox was full, and still the garden kept producing. So you canned. You filled mason jars with tomatoes, beans, pickles. You made relish chutney, jam. You blanched and froze what you could fit in the freezer compartment, and you shared the rest, walking next door with a basket of tomatoes, leaving a bag of beans on a neighbour's porch, trading carrots for someone else's cucumbers. By October the garden was spent. The plants turned brown and brittle. The tomatoes stopped ripening. The beans slowed to a trickle. You pulled up the dead plants, tossed them onto the compost pile, and raked the garden smooth. It looked bare and tired, but you knew it was just resting. Come spring, you'd start again. The victory garden wasn't about victory anymore. The war was over, but the habit remained. The knowledge that you could grow your own food, that you could feed your family from your own yard, that you didn't have to depend entirely on the store, that knowledge was worth keeping. And so the garden stayed, year after year, a small plot of earth that kept giving, season after season. Stains didn't mean the end of a garment. They meant you had work to do. Red wine on the tablecloth? Sprinkle salt on it immediately, let it absorb, then scrub with lemon juice. Grease on your apron. Rub it with dish soap and hang it in the sun. Ink on a shirt? Soak it in milk overnight. Every stain had a solution, and every housewife knew them all by heart. The salt trick was the most important one. It worked on almost anything: liquid, wine, juice, coffee, blood. The moment something spilled, you grabbed the salt shaker and poured it liberally over the stain. The salt absorbed the liquid, pulling it out of the fabric before it could set. You let it sit for a few minutes, watching it turn pink or brown or whatever colour the stain was. Then you brushed it off and assessed the damage. If the stain was still visible, you cut a lemon in half and squeezed the juice directly onto the spot. The acid in the lemon broke down whatever the salt hadn't absorbed. You rubbed it in with your fingers, working it through the fabric, feeling the fibres loosen and release their grip on the stain. Then you rinsed it in cold water and checked again. Most of the time the stain was gone, completely gone. If a faint shadow remained, you repeated the process, more salt, more lemon, more scrubbing, and if that didn't work, you hung the fabric in direct sunlight. The sun was a miracle worker. It bleached out stains that nothing else could touch. You'd hang a tablecloth on the line, still damp, and by evening the stain would have faded to nothing. Grease stains were different. They didn't respond to lemon. They needed dish soap, the kind you used for washing dishes, thick and sudsy. You rubbed the soap directly into the stain, working it in with your thumbs until the fabric was saturated. Then you rinsed it in hot water, as hot as the fabric could stand. The soap broke down the grease, and the hot water carried it away. For ink stains, you used milk. It sounded strange, but it worked. You filled a bowl with the milk, submerged the stained fabric and left it overnight. By morning, the ink had dissolved into the milk, leaving the fabric clean. You rinsed it, washed it as usual and hung it to dry. No one knew why it worked. It just did. Rust stains required salt and lemon again, but this time you laid the fabric in the sun while it was still wet. The combination of acid, salt and sunlight lifted the rust right out of the fibres. Grass stains got scrubbed with rubbing alcohol. Berry stains got soaked in vinegar. Each stain had its own remedy, and you knew them all. You learned these tricks from your mother, who learned them from hers. They were passed down like recipes, like traditions, like family secrets, and they worked not because they were magic, but because they were chemistry. Salt absorbed, acid dissolved, sun bleached, soap cut grease. It was science dressed up as housework, and every woman who used these methods understood them instinctively, even if they couldn't explain why. So when your daughter spilled grape juice on her dress, you didn't panic. You reached for the salt. When your husband came home with grease on his work shirt, you reached for the dish soap. When ink leaked from a pen onto the tablecloth, you reached for the milk. And every time the stain disappeared, the fabric was saved, and life went on. Ironing wasn't optional. Everything got ironed: shirts, dresses, pillowcases, even sheets. You set up the ironing board in the living room, heated the iron on the stove or plugged it into the wall, and worked your way through a basket of wrinkled fabric until everything was smooth and crisp. It took hours. But a well-ironed home was a sign of pride. The ironing board lived folded against the wall in the hallway closet. You pulled it out after breakfast, set it up near a window where the light was good, and adjusted the height until it hit you just below the waist. The board was padded, covered with a cotton cloth that had been washed and restretched so many times it was thin and smooth. It smelled faintly of starch and hot metal. The iron itself was heavy. If you had an electric one, you plugged it in and waited for it to heat. If you still used a flat iron, you set it on the stove until it was hot enough to sizzle when you touched it with a wet finger. Either way, the iron had to be the right temperature, hot enough to smooth the wrinkles, but not so hot it scorched the fabric. You started with the handkerchiefs and napkins, the small things that were easy to iron and didn't require much thought. You smoothed them flat on the board, pressed the iron down firmly and slid it across the fabric in long, even strokes. The wrinkles disappeared, replaced by crisp, flat cloth. You folded each piece neatly and stacked them on the chair beside you. Shirts came next. You ironed the collar first, then the yoke, then the sleeves, and finally the body. Each section had to be done in the right order, or the fabric would wrinkle again before you finished. You worked carefully, pressing the seams, smoothing the pockets, making sure the buttons didn't snag. When you were done, you hung the shirt on a hanger and moved on to the next one. Dresses took longer. They had more fabric, more seams, more details. You ironed the bodice, the skirt, the sleeves, the hem. You worked around buttons and zippers and pleats. You pressed carefully, making sure every inch was smooth. When you were finished, the dress looked brand new, ready to wear, ready to be seen. And then came the sheets. Most people didn't iron sheets anymore, even in the 50s. But you did. Because sheets that had been ironed felt different. They were smoother, cooler. They slid against your skin like silk instead of bunching up around your legs in the night. It took an extra hour, sometimes 2, but it was worth it. You spread the sheet across the ironing board, working in sections, ironing until the entire thing was smooth. Then you folded it carefully, creasing the edges, and set it aside. By the time you finished a full set, 2 flat sheets, 2 pillowcases, your arms ached and your back was sore. But when you made the bed that night, sliding between those crisp, cool sheets, you remembered why you'd done it. Ironing was meditative in its own way. The repetitive motion, the hiss of steam, the smell of hot cotton. Your mind wandered while your hands worked. You thought about the day ahead, the meals you'd cook, the errands you'd run. You listened to the radio, or you hummed to yourself, or you just let the silence settle around you. When the basket was finally empty, you unplugged the iron, folded the board, and carried the stacks of ironed laundry upstairs. Everything went into drawers or closets, smooth and ready to wear, and tomorrow or the next day the basket would fill up again and you'd start the whole process over, even though rationing had ended, the habits lingered. You still made cakes without eggs, stretched meat with fillers, and sweetened desserts with corn syrup instead of sugar. Because the memory of scarcity stayed with you, and wasting anything, even in abundance, felt wrong. You made do. You always made do. The war had been over for years, but your kitchen still remembered. You still measured carefully, used every scrap, stretched every ingredient as far as it would go. It wasn't about need anymore. It was about habit. About the lessons learned during those lean years when butter was rationed, sugar was precious, and eggs were saved for special occasions. You still baked cakes without eggs. You mixed vinegar into milk to make it sour, added baking soda to create lift, and used extra butter or oil to keep the cake moist. The result was different from a traditional cake, denser, more tender, with a tighter crumb, but it was still good, still sweet, still worth making. Meat was stretched with breadcrumbs, oatmeal, or mashed potatoes. You made meatloaf with half-ground beef and half filler, seasoned it well, and baked it until it was firm and brown. No one complained. No one said it tasted like anything other than meatloaf, because it was meatloaf. Just a version that made 1 pound of beef feed 6 people instead of 3. You sweetened desserts with corn syrup, honey, or molasses. Sugar was available now, but it still felt expensive, still felt like something to be used sparingly. So you used alternatives whenever you could. Corn syrup made pies glossy and smooth. Honey added flavour to cookies. Molasses turned gingerbread dark and rich. You also saved things that other people might throw away. Bacon grease went into the can by the stove. Vegetable scraps went into the soup pot. Stale bread became breadcrumbs or stuffing. Sour milk became biscuits. Wilted vegetables became soup. Nothing was wasted. Ever. These habits marked you as someone who'd lived through the war, even if you never talked about it. Other women your age did the same things, saved, stretched, substituted. It was a shared knowledge, a common language. When you brought an eggless cake to a church potluck, no one asked why. They just knew, and they appreciated it, because they'd done the same thing 100 times. The younger women, the ones who'd gotten married after the war, didn't always understand. They had full pantries. They bought what they wanted at the store. They didn't think twice about throwing away half a loaf of bread or pouring sour milk down the sink, and you didn't judge them for it. But you couldn't bring yourself to do it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because making do wasn't just about scarcity. It was about respect. Respect for the food. For the work that went into growing it. For the money that bought it. It was about knowing that abundance could end as quickly as it had begun. And it was about the quiet satisfaction of knowing you could still feed your family even if everything disappeared tomorrow. So you kept making do. You kept stretching. You kept substituting. And every time you pulled a cake out of the oven, or set a meatloaf on the table, or sweetened a pie with corn syrup, you remembered. And you were grateful. Throughout the day, the percolator sat on the stove, ready to brew another pot of coffee whenever someone stopped by. And someone always stopped by. A neighbour, a friend, your mother. You'd pour 2 cups, sit at the kitchen table and talk while the coffee cooled. It wasn't formal, it wasn't planned, it was just what you did. Coffee and conversation, the glue that held the neighbourhood together. The percolator never went far. After breakfast, you rinsed it out and left it on the stove, ready to go again. By mid-morning, you'd hear a knock at the back door, and there'd be your neighbour, still in her housecoat, holding an empty cup. "Got time for coffee?" she'd ask. And of course you did. You always did. You filled the percolator with fresh water, added new grounds, and set it on the burner. While it heated, you straightened the kitchen, wiped down the table, set out the sugar bowl and the cream pitcher. By the time the coffee started percolating, you'd both be sitting down, ready to talk. The conversations varied. Sometimes it was gossip. Who was expecting? Who'd bought a new car? What happened at the school board meeting? Sometimes it was advice. How to get crayon off the wall, whether to try that new detergent, where to buy, good chicken. Sometimes it was just venting about husbands, about kids, about the endless work of keeping a house. But mostly it was companionship. 2 women sitting at a kitchen table, drinking coffee, talking about nothing and everything. No agenda, no schedule. Just the warmth of the coffee and the comfort of knowing someone understood. You poured from the percolator, steam rising from the cups, the coffee dark and strong. You added cream and sugar, stirring slowly, watching the coffee lighten and swirl. Your neighbour did the same. You both took your first sips, the coffee still too hot but too good to wait for. And then you started talking. An hour might pass, maybe 2. The coffee cooled. You refilled the cups. The conversation wandered from one topic to another, meandering like a lazy river with no particular destination. Sometimes your kids came in, looking for a snack or settling a dispute, and you dealt with them quickly before returning to the table. Sometimes the phone rang and you answered it but kept it short. This was coffee time. This was your time. Eventually your neighbour would glance at the clock and sigh, "I should go, laundry's piling up," and you'd nod because your laundry was piling up too. But neither of you moved right away. You finished the last sips of coffee, you rinsed the cups in the sink, you walked her to the door and promised to do it again tomorrow. And you did. Tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever someone needed to talk. The percolator was always ready. The coffee was always hot. The door was always open. This was how neighbourhoods worked in the 50s. This was how friendships were maintained. Not through phone calls or scheduled lunches, but through impromptu coffee visits, unplanned and unrushed, woven into the fabric of daily life. The percolator made it possible. It sat on the stove, patient and reliable, ready to brew at a moment's notice. And every time you filled it, every time you heard it start to bubble and hiss, you knew that in a few minutes you'd be sitting down with someone who mattered, sharing coffee and conversation, keeping the connection alive one cup at a time. Baking soda wasn't just for baking. It was for scrubbing, deodorizing, soothing burns, brushing teeth, and putting out fires. You kept a box in the kitchen, another in the bathroom, and a third in the laundry room. It was cheap, it was versatile, and it worked. If you had baking soda, you could solve half the problems in your house before lunch. The box itself was simple, orange and white cardboard, with a picture of an arm and hammer on the front. You bought it at the grocery store for pennies, and it lasted for months. You kept the kitchen box next to the stove, always within reach, because you never knew when you'd need it. A grease fire, a burned pot, a sink that needed scrubbing. Baking soda handled it all. For cleaning, you mixed it with just enough water to form a paste. The paste was gritty and white, smelling faintly alkaline, almost like nothing at all. You scooped it onto a rag and scrubbed the sink, working it into the stains, watching them lighten and disappear. You used it on the stovetop, on the counters, on the inside of the oven. It cut through grease without scratching, left no residue, and rinsed away clean. You also sprinkled it dry into the drain to keep it fresh. A handful down the sink, followed by a kettle of boiling water, and the smell disappeared. You did this once a week, sometimes more often in summer when things spoiled faster and the drain smelled sour. The baking soda neutralized the odors, didn't just cover them up, but actually eliminated them. In the bathroom, you kept another box on the shelf above the sink. You used it to brush your teeth, just a pinch on a damp toothbrush, scrubbing in small circles until your teeth felt smooth and clean. It didn't taste like mint. It didn't foam. It just tasted like salt and chemistry. But it worked. Your teeth stayed white, your breath stayed fresh, and you didn't need to buy toothpaste. You also used it for upset stomachs. A teaspoon stirred into a glass of water, drunk slowly, and the heartburn eased. It wasn't pleasant. The fizzing, the salty taste, the way it sat heavy in your stomach for a moment before settling. But it worked faster than anything else, and it was always there in the cupboard, ready when you needed it. For burns, you made a paste with water and dabbed it gently onto the skin. The cool, gritty texture soothed the sting, drew out the heat. You'd burned yourself on the stove, on the oven door, on a hot pan. It happened. But the baking soda helped, and within a few minutes the pain faded to a dull ache. In the laundry room, you added it to the wash to brighten whites and soften water. You sprinkled it into shoes to absorb odours. You used it to scrub scuff marks off the linoleum floor. You even used it in the garden, dusting it on plants to discourage pests, though you weren't entirely sure if that one worked or if it was just something your mother had done. The point was, baking soda was everywhere. It solved problems you didn't even know you had. It was reliable, cheap, and endlessly useful. And every time you reached for that orange box, you felt a little bit more capable, a little bit more resourceful. Because if you could clean your house, soothe a burn, brush your teeth, and put out a fire with the same simple powder, what couldn't you do? You shopped once a week with a list and a strict budget. You knew exactly how much everything cost, and you planned your meals around what was on sale. If chicken was cheap, you bought chicken. If potatoes were marked down, you made potato soup. You didn't browse, you didn't impulse buy. You bought what you needed, paid in cash, and went home. Saturday morning was shopping day. You woke up early, made breakfast, and checked the pantry and icebox to see what was running low. Then you sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a scrap of paper, writing out your list. Flour, sugar, milk, eggs, butter, whatever else you'd run out of during the week. But the list was only a starting point. The real planning happened when you opened the newspaper and checked the ads. Each grocery store printed their weekly specials, and you studied them carefully, circling the best deals. Ground beef at 29 cents a pound. Canned peaches, 3 for $1. Bread, 2 loaves for $1. You planned your meals around those sales, building the week's menu from what was cheap. If pork chops were on sale, you made pork chops. If green beans were marked down, you bought extra and canned them. If nothing was on sale, you stuck to staples, beans, rice, potatoes, and made do. The goal wasn't variety. The goal was staying within budget. You kept the cash in an envelope in your purse. Every week your husband gave you the grocery money and that was all you had. No credit, no checks, just cash. You counted it before you left the house, making sure you had enough, and then you counted it again in the car. If you went over budget, you had to put something back so you didn't go over budget. At the store, you moved quickly and efficiently. You didn't linger. You didn't browse the aisles looking for inspiration. You went straight to the items on your list, checking prices as you went, making sure nothing had gone up since last week. If something cost more than you expected, you adjusted. You bought a smaller size, or you skipped it entirely, or you substituted something else. You also compared prices, not just between brands, but between sizes, between fresh and canned, between this week and last week. You knew that the store brand was almost always cheaper, and usually just as good. You knew that buying in bulk saved money, as long as you could use it before it spoiled. You knew that day-old bread was half price, and tasted the same once it was toasted. At the checkout, you watched the register carefully, making sure every price was correct. Mistakes happened. Sometimes an item rang up at full price, even though it was marked on sale. You spoke up when that happened. You weren't rude, but you weren't shy either. That money was yours, and you weren't going to let it slip away because someone forgot to update the register. When the cashier told you the total, you counted out the exact amount from your envelope, bills and coins handed over carefully. Then you took your change, tucked it back into the envelope, and carried your groceries to the car. You didn't have bags, you brought your own box or basket, so you packed everything yourself, making sure the eggs didn't break and the bread didn't get squashed. At home, you unpacked the groceries and checked the envelope again. Whatever was left went back into the drawer, saved for next week or for an emergency, and then you looked at what you'd bought, a week's worth of food, all within budget, and felt satisfied. You'd done it again. You'd fed your family, without overspending, without waste, without compromise. When summer fruit came into season, you canned it. Peaches, cherries, apples, berries, anything that grew locally. You sterilized the jars, filled them with fruit and syrup, sealed them tight, and boiled them in a water bath until the lids popped. Then you lined them up on a shelf in the basement, a row of jewel-toned jars that would last you through winter. Canning season started in July and didn't stop until October. First came the strawberries, bright red and juicy, arriving by the flat at the farmer's market. Then cherries, dark and sweet, with pits that stained your fingers purple. Then peaches, so ripe they bruised if you looked at them wrong. Then apples, crisp and tart, perfect for pie filling. Each fruit had its moment, and when that moment came, you canned. The process always started the same way. You filled the sink with hot, soapy water and scrubbed the jars until they were spotless. Then you boiled them in a big pot on the stove, along with the lids and rings, sterilizing everything until it was safe to use. The kitchen filled with steam, the windows fogged. You wiped your forehead with the back of your hand and kept working. While the jars boiled, you prepared the fruit. Strawberries got hulled and halved, cherries got pitted one by one, your fingers cramping from the repetitive motion. Peaches got blanched in boiling water, their skins slipping off in loose sheets, then sliced into perfect wedges. Apples got peeled, cored, and chopped. Every piece had to be uniform, neat, ready to pack into jars. You made the syrup on the stove, water and sugar, heated until the sugar dissolved, then brought to a gentle simmer. The ratio depended on the fruit. Light syrup for berries, medium for peaches, heavy for apples. You tasted it to make sure it was right, adjusting the sweetness, making sure it wouldn't overpower the fruit. Then came the packing. You lifted a hot jar out of the water with tongs, set it on a towel, and filled it with fruit. You packed it tightly but not too tightly, leaving headspace at the top for the syrup. You poured the hot syrup over the fruit, covering it completely, then ran a knife around the inside edge to release any air bubbles. You wiped the rim clean, set the lid on top, and screwed the ring down tight. One by one, you filled the jars. When you had a full batch, 7 jars usually, the number that fit in your canner, you lowered them into the boiling water bath. The water had to cover the jars completely, bubbling and churning, processing them for the right amount of time, 20 minutes for most fruit, longer for apples. You set the timer and waited. The kitchen was unbearably hot. Sweat dripped down your back. Your feet ached from standing, but you kept going, because this was how you made sure your family had fruit in January, in February, when fresh fruit was expensive and the winter felt endless. When the timer rang, you lifted the jars out carefully and set them on a towel to cool, and then you waited for the sound. The pop of the lid sealing one by one, a metallic ping that meant the jar was airtight, safe, preserved. You counted them as they popped, making sure every jar sealed. If one didn't, you'd put it in the icebox and use it right away. The sealed jars cooled slowly, and as they did, you wiped them clean and checked the seals one more time. Then you carried them down to the basement and lined them up on the shelf. Row after row of jars glowing in the dim light, red strawberries, dark cherries, golden peaches, pale apples, a rainbow of preserved summer waiting for winter. By the end of canning season, your shelves were full. Dozens of jars, maybe 100, each one representing hours of work, gallons of sweat, aching hands and tired feet. But when December came, and you opened a jar of peaches and served them over vanilla ice cream, you remembered. And it was worth it. After dinner, after the dishes, after the kids were in bed, you did one last loop through the kitchen. You wiped down the counters, you swept the floor, you set the table for breakfast, you checked the icebox, you wound the clock, and then, finally, you turned off the light and went to bed, knowing the kitchen was clean and ready for tomorrow. The routine was automatic by now, something you'd done so many times you didn't need to think about it. Your body knew what came next. Your hands knew where everything went. It was the final act of the day, the closing curtain before you could rest. You started with the counters. You wrung out the dishcloth, wiped down every surface, scrubbing at the spots where flour had spilled or grease had splattered. You worked in smooth circles, moving from one end of the counter to the other, making sure nothing was left sticky or dirty. Then you rinsed the cloth, wrung it out again, and draped it over the faucet to dry. The floor came next. You pulled the broom from the corner and swept in long strokes, pushing crumbs and dust toward the back door. You swept under the table, around the chairs, along the baseboards. The pile of debris grew, bits of food, dirt from shoes, a stray button, a hairpin. You swept it into the dustpan, dumped it into the trash and put the broom away. Then you set the table for breakfast. You laid out the plates, the bowls, the silverware. You set the sugar bowl in the center, the cream pitcher beside it. You folded napkins and placed them under the forks. Everything ready, everything waiting. So that in the morning, when you stumbled into the kitchen half awake, you wouldn't have to think. You could just start the coffee and sit down. You opened the icebox and checked the contents, making sure nothing had spoiled, mentally planning tomorrow's meals. The leftover chicken would become sandwiches. The vegetables would go into soup. The milk was running low. You'd need to leave a note for the milkman. You closed the door, satisfied. The clock on the wall needed winding. You reached up, opened the glass front and turned the key slowly, feeling the spring tighten under your fingers. You set the time, checked it against your wristwatch and closed the glass. The clock ticked steadily, a comforting sound, a reminder that time was moving forward, that tomorrow was coming, that life continued. You checked the stove one last time, making sure all the burners were off, that nothing was still warm. You glanced at the sink, at the dish rack, at the towels hanging on their hooks. Everything was in its place. Everything was clean. Everything was ready. And then you turned off the light. The kitchen went dark except for the faint glow from the streetlight outside. You stood there for a moment, letting your eyes adjust, letting the silence settle. The house was quiet. The kids were asleep. Your husband was already in bed. And the kitchen, your kitchen, was clean and ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. You walked through the doorway, up the stairs, to your own bed. Your feet ached. Your hands were dry from washing dishes. Your body was tired in that deep, satisfying way that came from a full day of work. But your mind was calm, because the kitchen was clean, the table was set, the clock was wound, and you'd done everything that needed to be done. Tomorrow you'd wake up and do it all again, but tonight you could rest. None of these tricks were written down. They were passed from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour, friend to friend. You learned by watching, by asking, by trying and failing and trying again. And when you had daughters of your own, you taught them the same way, standing side by side at the counter, hands in the dough, voices low and steady. Because this was more than housework. It was tradition. It was survival. It was love. Your mother had taught you how to knead bread, how to darn socks, how to stretch a roast. She'd stood beside you at the counter, guiding your hands, correcting your mistakes, praising your progress. She'd shown you how to crack an egg with one hand, how to test the heat of an iron with a wet finger, how to tell when a cake was done just by the smell. And you'd watched, you'd listened, you'd learned. Now your own daughter stood beside you, 8 years old, wearing an apron that dragged on the floor. She wanted to help. She wanted to learn. So you let her. You gave her a ball of dough and showed her how to knead it, pressing and folding, until her small arms grew tired. You praised her effort, even when the dough looked lumpy and uneven, because she was learning, and learning took time. You taught her how to set the table, how to fold a napkin, how to arrange the silverware just so. You taught her how to wash dishes, scrubbing in circles, rinsing thoroughly, stacking them carefully in the rack. You taught her how to crack an egg without getting shell in the bowl, how to measure flour without spilling, how to stir without splashing. She made mistakes. Of course she did. She spilled milk. She dropped a plate. She forgot to turn off the burner, but you didn't scold her. You just showed her again, patiently, gently, the same way your mother had shown you. Because mistakes were part of learning, and learning was part of growing up. Sometimes she asked questions. Why do we save bacon grease? Why do we iron sheets? Why do we darn socks instead of throwing them away? And you answered her honestly, because it's useful, because it makes things nicer, because we don't waste things in this house. And she nodded, absorbing the answers, storing them away for later. Your neighbour taught you things your mother hadn't known. How to remove a wine stain, how to make a fluffier meringue, how to keep the icebox from smelling sour. And you taught her things in return, how to make bread rise faster, how to preserve eggs in water glass, how to fix a squeaky hinge with bacon grease. The knowledge flowed back and forth, shared freely, traded like recipes. You also learned from trial and error. You burned your first batch of cookies. You ruined a shirt with too much bleach. You let bread dough rise too long and it collapsed. But you learned from those mistakes. You adjusted the oven temperature. You diluted the bleach. You watched the dough more carefully. And eventually you got it right. And now, standing at the counter with your daughter beside you, you realize that this was how it had always been. Mothers teaching daughters, neighbours teaching neighbours, women standing together in kitchens, passing down the knowledge that kept homes running, families fed, lives held together. It wasn't written in books, it wasn't taught in schools, it was handed down one generation at a time in the quiet moments between morning and night. Your daughter looked up at you, flower on her nose, a smile on her face. She was proud of the bread she'd helped make, proud of the dough she'd kneaded, proud of being allowed to help. And you smiled back, knowing that one day she'd stand in her own kitchen, teaching her own daughter the same things, the same tricks, the same traditions, the same love. Because this knowledge wasn't just about cooking and cleaning, it was about connection, it was about resilience, it was about knowing that you could take care of yourself and your family, no matter what life threw at you. And it was about passing that knowledge along, making sure it didn't die with you, making sure the next generation would be just as capable, just as resourceful, just as strong. So you kept teaching, you kept showing, you kept standing side by side at the counter, hands in the dough, voices low and steady. Because this was more than housework. This was how you built a home. This was how you built a life. And this was how you made sure that life would continue long after you were gone. Laundry day was Monday, always Monday, and the clothesline was where it all ended. You carried the wet clothes outside in a wicker basket, one piece at a time, shaking out the wrinkles before pinning them to the line. Sheets billowed in the breeze like sails, shirts hung by their shoulders, socks dangled in matched pairs. By afternoon, everything smelled like sunshine and fresh air, a scent no bottle could ever replicate. The clothesline stretched across the backyard, strung between two metal poles sunk deep into the ground. The line itself was thick cotton rope, soft from years of use, with a slight sag in the middle that you'd learned to work around. You kept the clothespins in a cloth bag that hung from the line, wooden pins worn smooth by your hands, a few cracked but still usable. Monday morning, you filled the washing machine, or the tub, if you were still washing by hand, and worked your way through load after load. Whites first, because they needed the hottest, cleanest water. Colours next. Towels and rags last, because they were the dirtiest. Each load got wrung out, either through the wringer attachment on the machine or by hand, twisted tight until the water stopped dripping. Then you carried the basket outside. The grass was still wet with dew. The air was cool and fresh. You set the basket down, pulled out the first item, usually a sheet, and gave it a sharp snap to shake out the wrinkles. The sound echoed across the yard, a crisp crack that announced laundry day to anyone listening. You pinned one corner of the sheet to the line, then walked it down, smoothing it as you went, pinning the other corner at the far end. The sheet hung heavy and damp, but the breeze caught it immediately, lifting it, filling it with air. It looked like a white sail, clean and bright against the blue sky. Next came the pillowcases, the towels, the shirts. You hung each one carefully, making sure they were straight, making sure the seams lined up. Shirts went on hangers first, then hung from the line by the hanger hook. It kept them from getting clothespin marks on the shoulders and made ironing easier later. Trousers hung by the cuffs, dresses by the shoulders. Everything had its proper place, its proper method. Socks and handkerchiefs went on a separate section of a line, the smaller items that dried quickly. You pinned socks in pairs, toe to toe, so they'd be easier to match later. Handkerchiefs got pinned by one corner, hanging like little flags in a row. As you worked, you kept an eye on the sky. Monday was laundry day, but Monday wasn't always cooperative. If clouds rolled in, if the wind picked up too much, if rain threatened, you had to work faster. You'd lost loads to sudden storms before, rushing outside to pull everything down, half dry and smelling like rain, having to hang it all inside on makeshift lines strung across the basement. But today the sky was clear. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, and you finished pinning the last items to the line. You stood back surveying your work, 3 lines full of clean laundry, swaying gently in the breeze, drying in the sun and air. It was satisfying in a way that was hard to explain. Visible progress, tangible results. You left the laundry to dry and went back inside to tackle the rest of the day's work. Every hour or so, you glanced out the window, checking on it. By mid-afternoon, the smaller items were dry. You unpinned them, folded them into the basket, and left the heavier things for another hour. By evening, everything was dry. You walked the line one more time, unpinning each item, folding it as you went. The sheets were stiff and crisp, smelling like sun and wind. The towels were rough but fresh. The clothes felt clean in a way they never did when dried inside. You carried the basket back into the house, your arms full of sunshine, ready to put everything away and start the week. The cookie jar sat on the counter, always full, always available. You baked on Saturday, sugar cookies, oatmeal cookies, molasses cookies, and filled the jar to the brim. The kids knew they could have one after school, one after dinner. Neighbours who stopped by were offered one with their coffee. The cookie jar wasn't just a container, it was hospitality, it was comfort. It was the currency of a well-run home. The jar itself was ceramic, painted with flowers or fruit, with a heavy lid that clinked when you lifted it. It had been a wedding gift, or an inheritance, or something you'd bought at a church sale. It didn't matter where it came from. What mattered was that it was always full, always ready, always there when someone needed a little sweetness. Saturday was baking day. You tied on your apron, preheated the oven, and pulled out the mixing bowls. You creamed butter and sugar together until the mixture was light and fluffy, beaten eggs one at a time, added vanilla. The kitchen filled with the warm, sweet smell of baking, a smell that meant home, meant love, meant someone cared enough to spend the afternoon making cookies. You made multiple batches, sugar cookies with a hint of almond, oatmeal cookies studded with raisins, molasses cookies, dark and spicy with crackled tops. You rolled dough, cut shapes, dropped spoonfuls onto baking sheets. You rotated pans in the oven, testing for doneness, pulling them out when the edges were just golden. The cookies cooled on wire racks spread across every available surface, the counter, the table, the top of the icebox. You'd bake all afternoon, batch after batch, until you had dozens of cookies cooling, filling the house with warmth and sweetness. Then you'd pack them into the cookie jar, layer after layer, fitting as many as you could. The jar sat on the counter, visible, accessible. The kids knew the rules. One after school when they came home hungry and tired, one after dinner if they'd eaten their vegetables. No sneaking extra. No taking more than your share. The honour system enforced by the knowledge that if cookies disappeared too fast, there wouldn't be any left for later in the week. After school, you'd hear the back door open, the sound of shoes being kicked off, and then small footsteps heading straight for the kitchen. The lid would clink, a hand would reach in, a cookie would disappear. Sometimes they'd eat it standing there, dropping crumbs on the floor. Sometimes they'd take it outside, sitting on the back step, swinging their legs. You didn't mind. That's what the cookies were for. When neighbours stopped by for coffee, you offered cookies automatically. You lifted the lid, held the jar out, insisted they take one. 2, if they wanted. The cookies were part of the ritual, part of the hospitality, part of what made your home a place people wanted to visit. And when they left, they always said thank you, always complimented your baking, always promised to return the favour next time. Your husband came home from work and reached for a cookie before he even took off his hat. You poured him coffee, and he sat at the table, tired from his day, dunking the cookie into the hot liquid until it softened. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The cookie said everything. Welcome home. I'm glad you're here. This is your place. By Friday, the jar was nearly empty. Just a few broken pieces at the bottom, crumbs and fragments that nobody wanted. And that was fine. That meant the cookies had done their job. They'd fed the kids, comforted the neighbours, welcomed your husband home. They'd been eaten, enjoyed, appreciated, and tomorrow you'd bake again. The cookie jar would never stay empty for long, because a home without cookies felt bare somehow, incomplete. And as long as you could bake, as long as you had flour and sugar and butter, the jar would be full, ready, waiting. a small, sweet promise that someone in this house cared enough to make sure there was always a little bit of comfort available, just for the asking. Wax paper was used until it couldn't be used anymore. You wrapped sandwiches in it for school lunches, folded it over leftovers, lined cake pans with it. Then you wiped it clean, smoothed it flat and used it again and again, until it tore, or the wax wore off, or it simply couldn't hold together anymore. Only then did it go into the trash, and even then you felt guilty about it. A new roll of wax paper sat in the drawer, but you didn't pull from it often. You used the old pieces first, the ones you'd already used once or twice or 5 times. They were folded neatly and stacked in a corner of the drawer, ready for another job. Some pieces were creased and wrinkled, some had faint stains from whatever they had wrapped before, but they still worked, and as long as they worked, you used them. In the morning, you made sandwiches for your husband's lunch pail and the kids' school lunches. You pulled out a square of wax paper, laid it flat on the counter, and placed the sandwich in the centre. Then you folded the paper over the sandwich, creasing the edges, tucking the ends underneath. The package was neat, secure, and when they unwrapped it at lunch, the sandwich would be fresh, protected from being squashed in their bags. After lunch, if the wax paper came home, if the kids remembered to bring it back, if your husband didn't throw it away, you unfolded it carefully and inspected it. If it wasn't too crumpled, if it wasn't covered in peanut butter or jelly, you wiped it with a damp cloth and set it aside to dry. Later, you folded it again and returned it to the drawer, ready for tomorrow. You also used wax paper to wrap leftovers, half an onion, a chunk of cheese, a few slices of meatloaf. You pressed the paper around the food, sealing it as best you could, and tucked it into the icebox. The paper kept the food from drying out, kept the smells from mingling. It wasn't as good as a proper container, but it worked well enough. When you baked cakes, you lined the pans with wax paper. You traced the bottom of the pan on the paper, cut out a circle, and pressed it into the greased pan. The cake baked, released cleanly, and when you turned it out, you peeled off the paper carefully. If it hadn't torn, if it wasn't too greasy, you saved it. You could get 2 or 3 uses out of a single piece before it finally gave up. Sometimes you used wax paper as a makeshift funnel, rolling it into a cone and using it to pour flour or sugar into jars. Sometimes you used it to roll out dough, placing it on the counter, dusting it with flour, rolling the dough thin. Sometimes you used it to separate burger patties before freezing them, so they wouldn't stick together. Every use extracted a little more value from that single sheet of paper. Every reuse meant you'd get a few more days before you had to pull a fresh sheet from the roll. And that mattered, because wax paper cost money, and money didn't grow on trees. Eventually the paper would fail. It would tear along a crease. The wax would wear thin in spots, no longer waterproof. It would become too wrinkled to lie flat, too fragile to wrap anything, and only then, only when it absolutely couldn't be used again, would you throw it away. And even then, you'd pause for a moment, holding the worn, crumpled paper in your hand, feeling like you were discarding something that still had life left in it. But you threw it away, because it was done. It had served its purpose multiple times over, and now it was time to pull a fresh sheet from the roll, fold it neatly, and begin the cycle again. Sunday dinner was sacred. The whole family gathered around the table at noon right after church for a meal that had been cooking since morning. Roast beef or chicken, potatoes, gravy, vegetables and pie for dessert. It was the one meal of the week that felt formal, abundant, complete. You set the table with your good dishes, used the cloth napkins, and made sure everyone washed their hands before sitting down. Because Sunday wasn't just another day. It was the day that reminded you what you were working toward all week. The roast went into the oven before you left for church. You seasoned it the night before, rubbing it with salt, pepper, and whatever herbs you had growing in the garden, rosemary if you were making beef, thyme if it was chicken. The meat sat in the icebox overnight, absorbing the flavours, getting ready for its transformation. Sunday morning, while the house was still quiet and the kids were getting dressed in their church clothes, you placed the roast in the roasting pan, surrounded it with quartered potatoes, carrots and onions, and slid it into the oven. The heat was low, the cooking slow, 3 hours, maybe 4, depending on the size. By the time you returned from church, the house would smell like Sunday, rich, warm, welcoming, unmistakable. Church let out at 11:30. Your family filed out of the pew, shook hands with the pastor, exchanged pleasantries with neighbours in the parking lot. Everyone moved a little faster than usual because everyone knew what was waiting at home. You drove back through quiet streets, past other families doing the same thing, all headed to their own Sunday dinners, their own tables, their own traditions. You walked into a kitchen already filled with the smell of roasting meat. The aroma hit you the moment you opened the door, thick and savoury, making your mouth water, reminding you why you'd gotten up early to prepare. The kids loosened their ties, kicked off their church shoes. Your husband hung up his hat, and you changed out of your church dress, tied on an apron, and got to work on the final preparations. The roast came out of the oven, dark and glistening. The vegetables caramelised around the edges, their sugars concentrated and sweet. You transferred the meat to your best platter, the white one with the blue trim that only came out on Sundays, and covered it with foil to let it rest. Resting was important. It let the juices redistribute, kept the meat tender. You'd learned that from your mother, who'd learned it from hers. While the roast rested, you made the gravy. You poured off most of the fat from the roasting pan, leaving just enough to make a roux, 2 or 3 tablespoons. Then you set the pan on the stovetop over medium heat, added an equal amount of flour, and stirred with a wooden spoon until it turned golden and smelled nutty. This was the foundation. You added liquid slowly, beef broth if you'd made roast beef, chicken stock if it was chicken, whisking constantly to prevent lumps. You scraped up the browned bits from the bottom of the pan, the fond that held all the concentrated flavour, whisking them into the gravy until it was smooth and rich and the colour of caramel. The gravy simmered while you finished everything else. Green beans boiled on the back burner, seasoned simply with butter and a pinch of salt. Rolls warmed in the oven, the ones you'd baked yesterday, brushed with melted butter until they gleamed golden. You pulled the roasted vegetables from around the meat and arranged them on a separate platter, and you mashed the potatoes, the ones that had cooked alongside the roast, now soft and flavoured with drippings. You added hot cream and butter, mashed them until they were smooth and fluffy, seasoned them with salt and white pepper. Then you set the table. This wasn't a weekday meal thrown together between chores. This was Sunday. The good dishes came out of the china cabinet, the ones with the delicate floral pattern around the rim, the ones you'd gotten as wedding gifts and only used for special occasions. The cloth napkins came out, starched and ironed, folded into neat triangles beside each plate. The silverware was polished, catching the light from the window. You placed everything carefully, precisely, making sure each setting was perfect, making sure the table looked like Sunday felt, important, deliberate, worth the effort. Your husband carved the roast at the table. It was his job, his ritual, the one part of the meal preparation that belonged to him. He stood at the head of the table, carving knife in one hand, fork in the other, slicing the meat against the grain into thin, even pieces. The meat was tender, falling apart under the knife, releasing steam and juice. He arranged the slices on the platter, overlapping them slightly, making them look as good as they tasted. You brought out the side dishes and set them on the table, potatoes in a serving bowl, vegetables on a platter, gravy in a pitcher, rolls in a basket lined with a cloth napkin. The table was full now, crowded with food, barely leaving room for elbows. It looked abundant. It looked like prosperity. It looked like everything you'd worked for all week had led to this moment. Everyone sat down. You said grace, holding hands around the table, your husband's voice steady and familiar as he thanked God for the food, for the family, for another week together. Then the dishes started moving. Potatoes passed to the left, vegetables to the right, gravy circling the table. Everyone served themselves, plates piling high with food, forks clinking against china, and then you ate. The meal was slow, leisurely, stretched out over an hour or more. There was no rushing on Sunday. The kids told stories from Sunday school. Your husband talked about something he'd heard at church, or something that needed fixing around the house. You listened, contributed, asked questions, enjoyed the luxury of time, because this was what Sunday was for. Not just the food, though the food was important, but the gathering, the togetherness, the reminder that you were a family, that you belonged to each other. The roast was perfect, tender and flavourful, seasoned just right. The potatoes were creamy and rich. The vegetables were sweet from roasting. The gravy tied everything together, smooth and savoury. You watched your family eat, watched them reach for seconds, watched them soak up the last of the gravy with pieces of roll, and you felt satisfied. Not just full, but satisfied. Because you'd made this. You'd planned it, prepared it, brought it to the table, and now you were sharing it with the people you loved most. Dessert came after. Always pie. Apple in the fall, made with fruit from your own tree. Cherry in the summer, the cherries you'd pitted and canned months ago. Pumpkin in the winter, spiced with cinnamon and ginger. You'd baked it yesterday, after the bread, while the oven was still hot. You served it with a scoop of vanilla ice cream that melted into the warm pie, or a dollop of whipped cream you'd beaten by hand until it formed soft peaks. Everyone ate slowly, savouring the sweetness, knowing that dessert meant the meal was ending, that soon the dishes would need to be washed and the afternoon would drift into evening. But for now the table was full, the family was together, and Sunday dinner was exactly what it should be. Abundant, warm, complete, and worth every minute of preparation. This was the meal you worked toward all week. This was the meal that made everything else make sense. By the end of the day, your hands told the story. Rough from scrubbing, softened by flour, marked by small burns and nicks. Your mother's hands had looked the same, her mother's before that. These weren't hands that stayed idle. They were hands that built homes, raised families, kept everything running. And when you looked at them, knuckles red, nails short, skin dry, you didn't see damage. You saw evidence of a life well lived. Your hands woke before you did, reaching for the alarm clock before it rang, silencing it so your husband could sleep a few minutes longer. They moved in the dark, knowing where everything was by touch alone. They lit the stove, their fingers finding the match without fumbling, striking it against the box with practiced ease. They filled the percolator with water, measured out the coffee grounds, set the pot on the burner. They cracked eggs into the pan, whisked them with a fork, scrambled them until they were soft and fluffy. They moved automatically through the morning routine, performing the same tasks they'd performed 1,000 times before, knowing what needed to be done, in what order, without conscious thought. By mid-morning, your hands were already tired. They'd scrubbed dishes in hot, soapy water, wrung out rags until the water ran clear, wiped down counters and stovetops. They'd kneaded dough, pushing and folding, until the gluten developed and the dough became smooth and elastic. They'd folded laundry fresh from the line, still warm from the sun, matching socks and smoothing wrinkles. They'd buttoned small buttons on children's shirts, tied shoelaces, braided hair. They'd opened stubborn jars, stirred pots of soup, chopped vegetables into uniform pieces. They moved constantly, never still, always working, always doing something useful. Your hands knew things your mind had forgotten, or perhaps had never consciously learned. They knew how much flour to add to the dough by feel alone, could tell when it was too sticky or too dry just by the way it responded to kneading. They knew when the dough was kneaded enough, when the gluten had developed sufficiently when it was ready to rise. They knew how to test the heat of the iron by holding them close, not touching, just close, feeling the radiant heat, knowing instinctively whether it was hot enough to press or too hot and likely to scorch. They knew how to darn a sock without looking, the needle weaving in and out in a rhythm so familiar you could do it in the dark, or while listening to the radio, or while talking to your daughter about her day at school. They knew how to crack an egg one-handed, tapping it against the edge of the bowl at just the right angle, pulling the shell apart with your fingers, letting the egg slide cleanly into the bowl without a single piece of shell following it. They knew how to test the heat of the oven by sticking them inside for just a second, not long enough to burn, just long enough to feel whether it was hot enough for bread or still warming up. They bore the marks of their work. Small burns from touching hot pans, grabbing pot handles you'd forgotten were hot, reaching into the oven without a proper hot pad. Faint scars from slips with the paring knife, from the grater, from the scissors. Calluses on the palms from scrubbing floors, from wringing out mops and rags, from years of constant friction against wood and metal and fabric. The skin was dry, cracked at the knuckles in winter no matter how much lotion you rubbed in at night, because the work dried them out faster than the lotion could repair them. Your nails were kept short, cut straight across with kitchen scissors, practical and plain. Long nails got in the way of everything. They broke when you kneaded bread. They collected dirt when you gardened. They caught on fabric when you sewed. So you kept them short, filed them smooth, and didn't think twice about it. Painted nails were for women who didn't have work to do. But they were strong hands, capable hands, reliable hands. They could lift heavy pots full of soup or stew, carry baskets of wet laundry that weighed more than your youngest child, open stubborn jars that your husband couldn't budge even with a dish towel for grip. They could grip a chicken firmly while you cleaned it, hold a knife steadily while you carved a roast, steady a mixing bowl while you beat batter. They could be gentle when they needed to be, soothing a crying child, smoothing a fevered forehead, braiding hair without pulling, buttoning a baby's tiny sweater, and firm when that was required, scrubbing a stubborn stain, kneading tough dough, wringing out a heavy towel. Your mother's hands had looked like this. You remembered watching them when you were small, marvelling at how fast they moved, how much they could accomplish in a single day. She'd make bread, hang laundry, mend clothes, scrub floors, cook 3 meals, all before dinner time, and her hands never stopped moving, never seemed to tire. You'd thought they were magic then, capable of miracles, able to fix anything, make anything, solve any problem. Now you understood they weren't magic. They were just well-trained, experienced, determined, and backed by decades of practice and knowledge passed down through generations. And now your own daughter watched your hands the same way you'd watched your mother's. She studied how you held the knife when you chopped vegetables, the angle of the blade, the rhythm of the cutting. She watched how you folded the dough over itself when you kneaded, how you turned it a quarter turn with each fold. She watched how you pinned clothes to the line, shaking them first to remove wrinkles, smoothing them flat, pinning them securely so the wind wouldn't blow them down. She was learning from you the same way you'd learnt from your mother, and your mother from hers. Not from words, not from written instructions, but from watching, from imitating, from slowly building the same knowledge and muscle memory into her own young hands, At night, after the dishes were done and the kitchen was clean and the children were in bed, you'd sit in the living room and look at your hands in the lamplight. They were red and chapped, marked by the day's work showing every hour of labour. Your knuckles ached, your fingers were stiff, the small burns throbbed faintly. You'd rub lotion into them, massaging it into the dry skin, working it into the cracks and calluses, trying to soothe the aches and pains that came with a full day's work. The lotion smelled like roses or lavender, a small luxury, a small kindness you showed yourself at the end of each long day. But you knew it wouldn't be enough. Tomorrow your hands would be dry again, rough again, aching again, but they'd be ready. They always were, because these hands had work to do. They had a family to feed, a home to maintain, a life to build and sustain. And they would keep working day after day, week after week, year after year, through all the seasons and all the changes, until they couldn't work anymore. Just like your mother's hands, just like her mother's before that. This was the inheritance, the legacy, the unbroken line of capable women who knew how to make a home, how to care for a family, how to keep life moving forward with nothing but determination and skill and love. And when you were old, when your daughter was standing in her own kitchen with her own children, her own routines, her own endless list of tasks, she'd look down at her hands, rough from work, marked by time, bearing the same scars and calluses you wore now, and she'd think of you. She'd remember how your hands moved, quick and sure. She'd remember what they created, what they built, what they held together. And she'd understand finally that this was more than housework, more than chores, more than daily drudgery. This was legacy. This was love made visible, made tangible, made real. This was how you built a life that mattered, one small task at a time, one meal at a time, one day at a time, with your own two hands and all the knowledge they carried. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your blanket, as the day fades and the world outside grows quiet, take a moment to think about those kitchens. Think about the women who stood at those counters, hands busy, minds wandering, keeping everything running through sheer determination and care. They stretched what they had. They made do. They passed down knowledge without fanfare, taught their daughters by example, and built homes that smelled like coffee and bread and something intangible, something that felt like safety. These weren't extraordinary people. They didn't think of themselves as living through history. They were just living, waking up, making breakfast, washing dishes, hanging laundry, doing the quiet, repetitive work that held families together and kept life moving forward. They didn't have convenience. They had routines. They didn't have shortcuts. They had skill. And they had each other, neighbours stopping by for coffee, daughters learning at the counter, husbands coming home to tables already set. Maybe there's something in that simplicity worth remembering. Not everything, not the hardships or the limitations, but the care, the patience, the knowledge that some things are worth doing slowly, worth doing well, worth doing with your own two hands. Maybe it's lighting a candle instead of flipping a switch. Maybe it's making something from scratch just because you can. Maybe it's just slowing down long enough to notice the small rituals that make a house feel like home. History isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a screen door and radio and someone down the street who knows your name, and that is enough. That has always been enough. So rest easy tonight. Let the weight of the day fall away, and if you dream, let it be of sunlight on clean sheets, of coffee percolating on the stove, of a time when life moved slower and hands knew what to do. Good night, and thank you for being here.